Hello again. Today I want to share with you the story in 2 Kings 5, a well-known story to many people. It's a story of Naaman who had leprosy. I find we read these stories sometimes and, I can tell my kids, like I'm going to tell you a story of Naaman and they will be like, oh, I already know that story, um, and sometimes kids can think, and we as adults can think, I've read these stories, I know these stories, there's nothing much new that I can learn from this, and we can kind of think we know these stories and we know what happens, and we can kind of get prideful in our knowledge of things, and I find I used to be like that more many years ago when I did some Bible college, and I used to think, oh, now I know these stories. I've read the Bible many times. I know these things, and and if that's my attitude, I don't learn anything else. Because I'm not open to it. I'm not. I think the Lord wants us to say, teach me more, open my heart and my eyes to new things, and He will. And for instance, this story, yeah, it's well known, but it's so deep. As I read it, I was like, wow, this is incredible. So I'll read the story and give some thoughts. I'll probably have to do two parts because there's just so much in here. And Naaman, the commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a man, a mighty one before his Lord. For Jehovah had given deliverance to Syria by him, and the man was a mighty one of strength, but being leprous. So just right here, we see a little bit about Naaman. One very interesting thing about this man was that it says very specifically in verse 1 that the Lord, for Jehovah had given deliverance to Syria by him. It was God, and we're going to come back to this a little later. It was God who raised Naaman up. Also, the other thing is Naaman would not have been, Naaman was a violent man, a man of war, a man who was a seasoned warrior. And the Syrians weren't known for, how gentle they fought, or, they were fierce warriors. And sometimes we forget that Naaman, that he was a man of war, and he was the top. He had the respect of everybody, and when he went into battle, he won. Another side note here also is that God works in people all around the world, people who don't know him, people who know him. Sometimes we can think that God only works in his own people, but here we see God very specifically. It's pointed out that God had given deliverance to Syria through this man. And so God works in people all over the world, all over, people whom we would never, like, why we may look at somebody and be like, like, what is he doing, or why, he's such a, we may have our opinions and judgments over it, but it may be God working in the background in some of the events that are going on. Another thing to notice is that he was leprous, and on the outside, we can look completely normal and perfect and function, because leprosy that came on, and sometimes you could have leprosy and not have many signs of it yet, and you could just act normal. Nobody would know, only a few people would know. But what's interesting here too is that's such a parallel to our own lives, like we can hide what's really going on inside, with a front, like you can pretend everything is normal on the outside, where inside there's actually big problems and big things that actually should come out and that we should tell others about, but we don't, because we like to hide things and hang things on, and that's just human. That's a default mode almost. We want to go back to, but that's also a raid from our enemy, Satan, who tries to make us keep things inside and makes us think that things will actually go better when we hide things. And actually it's not. It's better when they come out and when we can pray and encourage one another. So anyways, the Syrians had gone up out in bands, and they seized from the land of Israel a little girl, and she was before Naaman's wife. And she said to her mistress, "Oh, that my Lord were before the prophet who is in Samaria. Then he would take away her leprosy from him, take away his leprosy from him." So again, we are introduced to this little girl, a little girl that was taken from her family in Israel. And also, again, the question comes, why would God let these bad things happen to seemingly good people? And especially this little girl who was taken now, and she's a servant of Naaman's wife. And we may ask and be like, oh, what is going on? I wouldn't want my daughter to be taken from me, and her parents were probably most likely killed. But what else we notice is that this little girl has a love for Naaman. She is not hating him or saying, "I wish he were dead because he took my family." No, she's saying, I wish that he would go to this prophet that I've heard of, And this little girl, her parents must have told her the stories of Elisha and how God worked through this man, these miraculous things, because she has a faith, and you see her faith here working out through her words. She says, "Oh, I wish that he went to this prophet to be healed." And she also has a love for Naaman. So that shows me that Naaman, even though he has this exterior of being this commander and this mighty warrior, who's probably killed countless people, he has a soft side, and he probably was quite, it sounds like maybe they didn't have children, but I'm just speculating here. But maybe they didn't have any children, and this girl was more than just a servant. Maybe she was almost like a daughter, and he treated her, like a daughter. And so maybe that's why she has such love for this man, who where she was taken. She obviously was old enough to remember Elisha and the stories of the amazing things that he had done. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Keep her what she knows in mind, because later on we'll come back to that. So verses 4, and one went in and told his Lord, saying, "This and this she said, the girl who is from the land of Israel." And the king of Syria said, Go in, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. And he went and took in his hand 10 talents of silver and 6,000 talents of gold and 10 changes of garment. And came, so he basically goes to the king, and the king sends him on his way. And it's not just little things that he brings, but it is a tremendous amount of money that he takes with him. He's going to give everything he can to have his health back. And it's funny because we want to pay for things, when we want to give payment, especially for something like this too. You want to pay for something that God actually does not want payment for. God doesn't need anything from us, but it's funny that he brings all this money with him. So verse 6, it says, "And he came to the king of Israel with the letter, saying, And now, when this letter comes to you, behold, I have sent to you my servant Naaman, and you shall take away his this letter, imagine being the king and getting this letter. You shall take away this leprosy from him. It's kind of it's a political letter, yes, kind of, you know, there, because even thinking about this as the king of Syria, you know, is this actually going to be true? You know, like that somebody could actually heal this leprosy. That's unheard of. You know, just there's so many things behind the scenes. You know, like the king could have thought, well, you know, I'll send him. It's worth a try. But if not, you know, it's an occasion to go attack this land. You know, and maybe, you know, start a war or something. I don't know. It's just interesting. It's such a funny request. It's like, you heal him. And you know, when we look at the response of the king of Israel, it's like, yes, like I kind of would have responded that way as well. But we're going to contrast that with something else. So in verse 7, and it happened when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his garments and said, am I a god to kill and to keep alive, that this one is sending to me to take away his leprosy from a man? For consider now and see, for he is seeking an occasion with me. You know, and this king, I believe the kings at that time over Israel were located in Samaria as well. And it sounds like this little girl, I don't know if she was from Samaria, but she probably would have been near Samaria. So when we contrast their two responses, the king who lives in Samaria, where actually Elisha lived, knew that there was somebody in Samaria who could take care of this leprosy. And she believed that he could. She had a childlike faith. Then we see the king who, you know, who lives in Samaria where Elisha is, and he doesn't have that faith. He doesn't seems like he doesn't even know about Elisha or the things that he does, or choose to, you know, see God's power at work at all, because most of the king of Israel, maybe even all of them, maybe with an exception of one, were godless men and did evil in the sight of the Lord. So we see this king and his answer, and interestingly, he tears his clothes, and this little girl seems to know more about, you know, who would be able to help in this situation than the king does. So in verse 8 it says, and it happened when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his garments, he sent to the king saying, why have you torn your garments? So again, he's like, why have you torn your garments? Let him come now to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So yeah, like, in the background of this story, we see God's hand at work. We see how this, you know, the puzzle is coming together. We see that this girl is taken from her land. She seems to know about the man of God, and probably the God behind the man of God. She gets taken, and Naaman himself then hears of this prophet through this little girl. And the story kind of unfolds to bring Naaman, this mighty man of war, to God himself. So we're starting to get a glimpse of the greater picture here. And sometimes when we go through something, we don't see the greater picture at work. You know, we see the situation we're in, and it may look very dark and dire, but when we come out of that and sometimes look back, I'm sure you can look back to things in your life, and once they start to unfold, it's like, oh, I do see God's hand in this. And so here we kind of see God's hand starting to move the pieces, you know, and to bring things together, to bring a completeness to this whole thing, to this whole story. So I'm going to end there because it's getting long, and I will continue with part 2, starting off right kind of where we left off. Bye.